Hello, and welcome back to Felony Spectator. I am your host, Heather. I always see this at the end, but in case you're new here, please hit subscribe to support my channel. On today's episode, we're talking about the gruesome murder of Karen Gregory, who was killed in the middle of the night by someone who the community least expected, George Lewis. A neighbor, a firefighter, a community watch captain, and highly respected. This case is also frustrating, but let's just get right into it so you know what I'm talking about. Karen Gregory was the oldest of 4 children, and her younger siblings really looked up to her. She was the trailblazer of the family and had carved out quite a path for her siblings to follow. With her family, she was strong and assertive, but she also had a shy side. Karen was also smart, got really good grades in school, and was really creative. After high school, she moved out of the home and would attend Nazareth College, where she studied art and was extremely proud when one of her sculptures were put out on permanent display. Being here really helped her figure out who she was and what she wanted from life, and her world views. Karen had also been photographed and put in the local newspaper while sitting with Vietnam War protesters, and had strong feelings about the war that happened in the 60s. She also didn't want to conform to the standard of what the world felt was normal. This resulted in Karen wearing combat boots when she walked across the stage to collect her diploma when she graduated from Nazareth, which her mother wasn't too happy to see such footwear, but would laugh about it later on. At 36 years old, Karen would be starting a new chapter in her life. While she had lots of experience in teaching and art and working in mental hospitals, she had found a new job in graphic design. The job was hard, but she loved it. She also recently moved in with her boyfriend David in Gulfport, Florida after a year of dating. David Mackey was an administrator of a counseling program for Vietnam veterans. So they had the same ideologies, loved reggae concerts, and seemed to be the perfect match. David's house was in a quiet suburban neighborhood with large oak trees in the front yard. Across the street from them sat a house with a crime watch sign in the front yard. The neighbors got along, and Karen seemed really happy. On May 22nd, 1984, Karen went to her old apartment she shared with her good friend Anita one last time to grab the last of her stuff, mostly just houseplants. She had mentioned that David was going to go out of town to a conference for a week in Rhode Island with some other veteran counselors, and she was a bit nervous being alone for the first time since she moved in. Anita reassured her that she was in a really safe neighborhood and if there was any issues to just call. She also had plans to see her best friend that night, and I want to say her friend's name is Naverne, but I can't 100% clarify that. Naverne was going away for a week out of town to a wedding, so Naverne asked Karen to look after her cats while she was gone and wanted to give Karen her house key. Karen arrived around 7:30 p.m. They had dinner, drank some wine, and made plans to go windsurfing when she arrived back. Karen left around midnight in her little white Volkswagen Rabbit. The next day, on May 23rd, David called Anita Kilpatrick, Karen's ex-roommate and good friend. David was concerned because he hadn't heard from Karen. He had called the house several times with no answer, so he wanted to see if maybe Karen had decided to stay at the apartment. Anita said Karen had left the previous day with her plants and thought maybe she was with her sister Kim. David would then call Kim, but she wasn't there either. Throughout the day, David reached out to her employer and other friends of Karen's, all confirming that they hadn't heard from her. The next morning, on May 24th, he called Anita again to see if Karen had reached out. To his dismay, Karen still hadn't spoken with anyone. So David would call Amy Bressler, a neighbor who lived up the street, and asked her if the Volkswagen Rabbit was in the driveway. She told him yes, and David would ask if she could go over and see if Karen was home. Amy agreed, but when she walked up, she immediately noticed that there was broken glass on the front porch. The door was closed, but several of the jalousie window panes were broken. She would knock, but there was no answer. She would then walk to the side door, but that door was closed too. She would then walk to the back of the house and saw that the window to the bedroom was open. She called out, but again, there was no answer. She then reached her hand through a tear in the window screen and pulled back the curtain to see an unmade bed, as well as the lower half of a body laying in the hallway just outside the bedroom door. 911 was called, and upon entry, it was clear that this was no accident. Blood was pooling around Karen's head, and she was stabbed several times, all centering around her neck area. And it appeared whoever killed her also tried to slit her throat. Karen was only partially dressed, but strangely, there was a black teddy pulled over her white t-shirt. It almost appeared as though whoever killed Karen had forced her to put the teddy on because it just seemed really out of place. There was also several bloody handprints on her body with a large handprint on her thigh. Photos have not been released, but it's said that her killing was quite gruesome. At the scene, investigators noticed that there were bloody, bare footprints on the floor on the carpet. But Karen's feet were clean, so these footprints had to be from her attacker. Unfortunately, due to it being carpet, the footprints didn't have any ridges for identification like a fingerprint. There was also a blue Hawaiian shirt left on the bed, blood on the windowsill, on the curtain, a partial bare footprint on the floor of the tile bathroom, more blood on the bed, on the walls, as well as drops leading from the front door. Karen had been stabbed 13 times with a buck-style knife. There were cuts and bruises on her hands, and it appeared as though she fought hard for her life. Not only was Karen murdered, but she had also been raped as well. There was hair on the broken glass of the front door, so investigators also thought she must have ran to the front door to escape and either tripped or fell into the jalousie before being pulled back into the home by the attacker. And this is probably when Karen screamed as loud as she could to try and get the attention from her neighbors. So it was learned that most of the neighbors were woken up by a blood-curdling scream, and this would be the most frustrating part of the investigation. Why did so many of the neighbors who had heard screams not call the police? Some people said they peered out their front window, but went back to bed when they didn't see anything. Some would say that they were too scared to call. Others thought that since the screams had stopped, that everything must be resolved. One neighbor assumed that someone else would call, so they chose not to get involved. One thought it was a cat screeching. Another thought maybe someone had a nightmare, but nobody thought to call for help. Glenda Harness, who lived catty-corner across the street, was woken up by the scream, looked out the window towards the garage where her boyfriend was working, but he wasn't there and the light was off. She was so scared of the scream that she grabbed a heavy flashlight to use as a weapon and curled into a ball, waiting for her boyfriend to come back into the house. George Lewis, Glenda's boyfriend, was 22 years old, a local firefighter, and well-respected in the community. He was the unofficial captain of the neighborhood crime watch and often seen walking around the neighborhood talking to people. He helped them on their properties and was a really friendly person. George was also friends with the lead detective, Larry Tosi, and said that he would do anything it took to find who did this to his neighbor. George mentioned that he too heard a faint scream and had walked down the driveway, down the street a small ways to see where the scream had come from. George didn't realize that the scream came from Karen and David's across the street. He had been working in the garage that night with his radio on, so it was really hard for him to hear which direction the scream had come from. Unfortunately, he didn't hear it again after and went back to the garage to continue to work when he saw a man ride past on a bike. Strangely, even though he heard a woman scream, he didn't know where it came from. He still didn't check on his own girlfriend who had been sleeping. George did remember that the following night, after hearing the scream, a man would drive up to Karen's house, walked to the front door, and then walked back down to his car before leaving. Martha Borkowski, who lived right across the street, noticed the next morning that David and Karen's front door was open. Unfortunately, she didn't put that together with the scream she heard the night before. Apparently, David's front door would occasionally swing open, so she didn't really think anything of it. Later in the day, as it was getting dark, she too saw a man drive up to the Gregory's residence, but she didn't recognize him. And this is presumably the same man George had seen as well, who left a note. The note was recovered by police and was written by Peter Kumble. It read that he had stopped by and found, quote, "no signs of life," end quote, and he wouldn't be back but had something they wanted. It was signed by Peter with a phone number. Peter Kumble was a friend with Karen and David, and he had swung by the house to drop off a cassette tape. When police questioned Peter, he was very cooperative with police and gave his fingerprints and footprints as well and offered to answer all of their questions. Peter did have a large cut on his hand, which police noted, but Peter said it was from a dog and it had been there for a few days. Police also wondered how Peter did not notice the broken glass on the front door, and why hadn't he called police? Peter just said he didn't notice, and his alibi was that he was home with his roommate that night, and his alibi checked out. So Peter was allowed to leave and wasn't arrested, but the police kept him on their radar as they weren't sure they believed him. But at the same time, why would Peter leave a note putting himself at the scene of the crime? David, Karen's boyfriend, had also agreed to meet with police. Even though Peter Kumble was a friend, David too was surprised by the verbiage of the note, but had no reason to think that his friend Peter was involved. David's alibi that he was away on business also checked out, and he had also taken a lie detector test too and passed with no issues. So who did this? One thing that confused David was this blue Hawaiian shirt. He couldn't recall if Karen owned something like a Hawaiian shirt. Naverne also thought Karen wasn't wearing a Hawaiian shirt while they had dinner that night, so whose was it? Did that mean the killer must have brought it into the home? Perhaps he wore the Hawaiian shirt on his face to conceal his identity. David also noticed that there was a white teddy missing. Karen had just bought it and had only worn it on one occasion. So did the killer take the teddy with him too? Police didn't really have a lot to go on. Any prints left behind had been useless, mostly because of how long it took for the investigation to begin. Prints on Karen's body were absorbed into her skin in a way that destroyed any ridges of the fingerprints, and prints on the window panes were smudged and blurred when police entered the home. There was semen left behind, but it wasn't enough to get anything useful. And this was back in the 80s, so DNA wasn't really a thing yet, and it was very difficult to test at the time. Crime scene analyzers also failed to vacuum the house for hairs, fibers, or any other evidence. The crime scene was also cleaned prematurely because everyone assumed that the prints would be enough. So investigators weren't able to return to the crime scene because it was already clean. They really didn't anticipate the prints not being usable. Then in December of 1984, lead detective Larry Tosi would preside at the wedding of George Lewis and Glenda Harness. Remember, they were all friends. George and Glenda would tie the knot at the fire hall inside a basket of a ladder truck. At this point, Detective Tosi had no reason to believe his friend George would be involved, and they remained friends for a while. Just a few weeks after the wedding, Detective Tosi got another tip. A neighbor who lived 3 blocks east mentioned that she heard the scream too, one of which was so loud, long, drawn out that she thought it sounded like someone was either in pain or extremely upset. This neighbor had nightmares for a long time after learning about the murder because the scream had sounded so haunting. Police decided to speak with George Lewis again because Tosi wondered why was he the only one that heard a faint scream. How could someone 3 blocks away hear Karen so loudly, but George couldn't? Another thing that really bothered police was that George was a firefighter, someone trained to save lives, but still didn't bother to call 911 after hearing the scream. George technically still wasn't a suspect at this point. Larry Tosi did trust him and thought that speaking to George was a little bit helpful. He did wonder, though, if George knew something more and was holding back. George insisted that what he heard was just a faint scream and nothing that would indicate that someone needed help. His story changed slightly. Instead of walking down the road a bit, he says he stopped at the end of the driveway and looked up and down the street. When he didn't see anything, he went and turned off the light in his garage, closed the door, and went inside, where he took off his clothes and showered. Not a huge discrepancy. It would be normal to turn off a light and lock up when you're done in the garage. He also said that it was a habit to take off his work clothes and shower. But George also mentioned that he didn't hear any glass break, which would also be strange since Karen's head basically went through the front door. Police asked if George would take a polygraph test, which George did, and he would fail. George would start to cry when he failed and said that he did actually have something to add. Now, when he heard the scream, he turned the light off in the garage and then went down to the end of the driveway. And this would match his girlfriend's statement, who looked out at the garage to see the light off and her boyfriend gone. George said he stood at the end of the driveway to let his eyes adjust and then saw someone. A tall man with red hair, a trimmed light red beard with broad shoulders standing near a large oak tree in Karen and David's front yard. The man had a green V-neck style shirt on and black or dark colored dress pants. Why he never mentioned this before was curious. George hears a scream, sees a suspicious man, and still doesn't call for help. According to George, he went back inside, so he never saw the man leave. He also didn't tell his wife, who was his girlfriend at the time, in fear of scaring her. He didn't tell police because the man saw him. They made eye contact, and he was worried for his wife and baby. Note, their baby wasn't born yet, and George wasn't even convinced that Glenda was pregnant back then. With this new information, police needed to talk to neighbors again about the suspicious man. Did anyone else see someone of this description? Nobody had seen anyone that night, but one lady said she thought she was recently being watched by a man who could possibly match that description. One night, she went to her window to investigate and saw a man, and the man ran away. She wasn't 100% sure, but she thought it was George Lewis, who also had red hair. About a year after Karen's murder, police leads were all coming back as dead ends. Karen's family were also stumped because Karen had no enemies. If it was a stranger, why did they choose Karen's house? Both Karen and David's cars were in the driveway, so it would have appeared to be that the house had people home. They wondered if the person knew if Karen was home alone. Even though Tosi was friends with George, he still couldn't shake that George had changed his story. Also, how could George see so much detail in this mysterious man when it was 1 a.m., dark, and raining? So police would do a reenactment, and George was to participate. They had someone dress in a similar outfit, positioned approximately the same distance away. When George was asked to describe the person, he had a really hard time. He couldn't make out the color of the jacket, nor the hair color, or who it was. George didn't even realize it was actually someone he had known for years. George blamed the lighting and said it must have been much brighter on the night Karen was murdered. But when asked if he left his property and maybe had a closer look, he said no, he never left his driveway, which was the opposite to his first statement when George said he walked down the roadways. George still maintained his innocence, so there wasn't much they could do. Anyone who knew George really trusted him, and he was said to not be a violent person. He was extremely mechanical, good with his hands, and liked to work in his garage, sometimes until 2 or 3 a.m. What he loved the most was being a firefighter. He started out as a kid who loved fire engines and volunteered as a firefighter in 1980. 2 years later, he would go through basic training and was hardworking and friendly according to his instructors. When he became a full-time firefighter, everyone was really happy for him, and he was said to be, quote, one of the good ones, end quote. Even though George was a valued member in the community, and most people who knew him thought he was upstanding, that wasn't true with everyone. Allegedly, he had abused his previous wife and was in a swingers club. No shame to open marriages, but it sounds like it wasn't really agreed to by his ex-wife, which is kind of important. Before Glenda, George had married a woman named Denise in 1980. Their relationship didn't last long, and they were divorced by 1982. Despite the fact that his friends said that he was easygoing and kind, Denise said he was argumentative and hot-headed. She claims he had hit her several times when they were together and even tried to strangle her. George was also constantly girl watching, as she puts it. She would remember him saying, quote, "Would you look at that?" end quote, at any female that caught his eye. Denise, however, was never allowed to speak with another man, and he treated her like property, even to the point where he forced her to quit her waitressing job because he didn't want men flirting with her. One day, while they were boating with some friends, he noticed Glenda Harness and oogled at her in her bikini, saying to Denise his favorite line, "Oh, would you look at her?" He was also caught getting other women's phone numbers and caught in other lies, but he never would admit to it. Even if he was caught red-handed and she could prove it, he always denied everything. It was when he tried to strangle her did she finally leave. Unfortunately for Denise, he had already slept with Glenda Harness, the woman in the bikini they met boating, and Glenda and George would continue their relationship after Denise left. Glenda and George would argue a lot too, but according to George, it was just regular little bickers. But Glenda had moved out shortly after the murder around June due to the fighting with George all the time. When Glenda was gone, George started sleeping with a 16-year-old named Tanya. Tanya would meet someone else by September, and Glenda and George would make amends, so Glenda moved back in. Then they quickly got married in December, and Glenda was at least 6 months pregnant at their wedding. Friends would say George didn't seem happy that summer, and the pregnancy wasn't planned. George also started to go out drinking more around this time and also tried to arrange orgies. A fellow firefighter later testified that the days before the murder, George and Glenda were having huge arguments. George did not want to get married and questioned if Glenda was actually pregnant at all. It wasn't until it was confirmed and he decided that he didn't want his child to grow up without a father. It's said by some of George's friends that he had noticed when Karen moved into the neighborhood and joked that he was hoping he could convince her to have a threesome. Karen, however, was in a relationship with David, and as far as David or anyone else knew, Karen hadn't even said hello or spoken to George whatsoever. George would be questioned again and again, and investigators started to put pressure on George because George failed the lie detector test and failed the reenactment. And again, George kept changing his story. It had evolved to George claiming to have spoken to the man on the lawn. George asked him what was the matter and was told to get lost and not say a goddamn word or he'd get back and kill him. Police tried to call him out in his lies, but George said that was it. He had come clean and had nothing else to hide. He did not go into Karen's house, did not kill her. He only is a witness to seeing a man outside. Detective Tosi and George's wives were also friends who worked at the bank together, so this whole ordeal was just really stressing the detective out. Larry Tosi really wanted to believe his friend, but everything George was saying seemed to be lies. Everything kept leading back to George. So in 1986, investigators would go back to the evidence of the crime scene and examine the partial footprint found on the bathroom tile. Originally, it was said it was too small, blotchy, and unusable, but they persisted and asked for the bloody footprint to be enlarged big enough to see if there were any ridges or any way to make identification. Investigators finally got what they needed: ridges. So they sent the image off, as well as George's print that he had voluntarily given years ago, and sent them to Washington, and they came back a positive match. Now, George had always said he did not go into Karen's house. He said he was scared because he was verbally threatened by this red-haired man outside. When police told him that they had matched his footprint inside the house, he still denied it, saying that he wasn't even barefoot that night and seemed really confused. Larry confirmed that they had a 31-point comparison done by the FBI, so George would then ask for a lawyer because he needed to get this all straightened out. It was then that police told him he was under arrest for the murder of Karen Gregory. Then, all of a sudden, surprise, he changed his story again. He immediately started crying and then admitted that he did actually go into the house, but he didn't murder Karen. After seeing the tall man outside Karen and David's house, he walked across the street for a closer look. He crept to one of the back windows and climbed inside, where he saw Karen dead on the floor. He didn't touch her though. He said he saw her throat was slashed and she was already dead. So then he ran out of the house because he was scared. He was also scared of the man who saw him, and also thought that if he called it in, he would be a suspect because he had no reason to be inside the house. He just didn't want to get involved. Police had kept most of the details of Karen's injuries a secret. In fact, the way she was found didn't even show her neck, so anyone who came into the house wouldn't have known her neck had been slit, because you couldn't see her neck. Only the killer would have known that detail. Also, why would he climb in the window? Who does that? So George was finally charged with Karen's murder. The judge had set George's bail at only $150,000. Unfortunately, when the bond hearing commenced, the defense were there to state that George had no criminal record, had strong ties to the community, and he wouldn't be a risk. But the prosecution didn't show up. The night before the hearing, an electrical storm had knocked out the power, and the prosecution slept in and missed the hearing. Since nobody was there to argue against the defense, the judge set the bail unusually low. The bail was later raised to $300,000, which is still unusually low for a capital murder charge. The trial was stressful. George was so well respected and so well liked that most of the community thought he was innocent. People put together money to pay his bail. Some even offered to put up their homes to secure his bond. So many people thought he was innocent, including the fire hall that he worked at. So George was able to secure bail and was released back into the public, back home to his wife and daughter. George had also stayed in the same hotel as the jurors during the trial. Now imagine being a juror sharing a hotel with the accused and seeing him swim in the pool during the evenings as a free man. Karen's family also had to endure seeing him walk the halls in regular clothes, hugging his wife and playing in the halls with his kid, and just appearing to live normally. There was definitely an impression of innocence when someone is out on bail. While awaiting trial, George was still employed as a firefighter, still receiving his bi-weekly salary for a while, and even received his annual pay raise and a general wage increase as well. Fellow firefighters donated their vacation time to him, and George would eventually be on judicial leave from the fire department, but he had too much support from the community who knew him. During the trial, when George was on the stand, he suddenly added another detail to try and explain why his bloody footprint was in the bathroom. He now said when he saw Karen, he was so upset that he ran to the bathroom and threw up in the toilet. And that might make sense, but there was no indication that someone was sick in the bathroom. It was actually extremely clean, which is odd because the footprint was about 5 feet away from the toilet. Coworkers of George also testified that George was not a squeamish person, and being a certified EMT, he never walked away from someone who needed help. Again, why was this detail added and not told to the investigators during the first several interviews? It's assumed that it's because George was present during the pre-trial discovery where he learned about the footprint and where it was found, which was the bathroom, information he wasn't aware of before. George tried to explain that he didn't want anyone to know that he had accidentally walked through a crime scene. Luminol testing showed that there was actually several footprints around Karen's body, proving that he didn't simply just walk through it on the way to the toilet. Most of the footprints all faced towards Karen's body, not towards the bathroom, including the bloody footprint in the bathroom. It was facing towards Karen in the doorway. So how did he manage to throw up in the toilet 5 feet away, facing the opposite direction with no mess? Now, prosecution obviously didn't buy his many versions and presumed his motive was that George wanted to rape Karen. He learned that David was out of town, snuck across the street, and forced himself on her. George would have no other choice but to kill her if she figured out it was him, because his firefighting career and reputation was just too important. The defense claimed George was in the wrong place at the wrong time. When he saw Karen was so brutally murdered, he feared that reporting the crime would result in him being the main suspect. He made the mistake of sneaking in instead of using the front door, so it looked suspicious. George had a clean record and was well respected, had no history of hurting people, and it couldn't have been him. They pointed towards Kumble based on the note saying no signs of life. Another piece of evidence that would later pop up was the missing white teddy. Investigators found Tonja Dishong, who George had briefly been with the summer after Karen was murdered, when Glenda left. Tonja confirmed that George had given her a white teddy. It was lace front and was identical to the missing teddy that David mentioned before. The teddy was a size small, but it was too big for Tonja, but she wore it anyway to make George happy. Karen, however, was a true to size small. Bringing in this teddy almost backfired for the prosecution because Tonja and Karen were different sizes. Tonja was very skinny, very petite, so it didn't look like both of the women could fit the same teddy. Despite that little hiccup, the rest of the evidence was conclusive enough for the jury to agree unanimously that George Lewis was guilty. George had maintained his innocence throughout the investigation, throughout the trial, and pursued appeal after appeal to fight his conviction. He never once took ownership of the murder. George died in prison at the age of 52, but went to the grave claiming he did not kill Karen Gregory. My thoughts? Personally, I think he was guilty, and I think justice was served. There were far too many lies, and they just didn't make sense. The bloody footprint really is the giveaway, and he couldn't even get that right. I think I side with the jury when I find it very strange that a trained EMT would run away instead of calling for help. Had he entered the home after hearing a scream and found his neighbor murdered, there would be no reason to believe that he was lying. One last thing, I will never ignore a scream again, and I hope that all of you will also vow to never ignore a scream again either. We've got to look out for each other. Thanks again for joining me here at Felony Spectator. Please hit subscribe and support my channel, and we will see you again soon.